There is a year that functions like a wall. Everything on one side of it belongs to one version of America. Everything on the other side belongs to a different one. That year is 1913. And once you understand what was dismantled in that single calendar year, you will never read American history the same way again. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created. In 1913, the income tax was made permanent through the 16th Amendment. In 1913, the direct election of senators was installed through the 17th Amendment, removing the last structural check that state governments had over federal power. 3 foundational changes to the architecture of American life, all inside the same 12 months. The official version of history presents these as reforms, as modernizations, as the natural evolution of a growing nation trying to catch up with the demands of a complex economy. But the premise underneath that story matters more than the story itself, because that explanation only works if you accept the idea that what existed before 1913 was insufficient, primitive, somehow inadequate for a civilized society. But when you actually look at what existed before 1913, not through textbooks written after 1913, but through the physical record, the engineering record, the financial record, and the suppressed patent record, that premise begins to collapse. Before 1913, the American federal government ran without an income tax for the overwhelming majority of its existence. Before 1913, there was no permanent central bank controlling the issuance of currency and setting the price of money for the entire economy. Before 1913, a man named Nikola Tesla had already demonstrated a system for transmitting electrical power through the ground and the atmosphere without wires, without meters, without billing infrastructure, and without the ability of any corporation to charge you for it. And before 1913, the cities of this country were filled with buildings so technically sophisticated, so perfectly executed, and so far beyond the documented construction capacity of the era that the official explanations for how they were built have never fully satisfied anyone who studies them carefully. Something existed before 1913 that the people who built 1913 needed to destroy. And they destroyed it methodically, legally, and completely. What we inherited was not the natural progression of American civilization. It was the controlled remnant of something that had been taken away in a single year. To understand what was taken, you have to go further back than 1913. You have to return to a world that the official timeline of American history has never fully explained. A world that still appears in the physical record as foundations too deep, buildings too grand, and infrastructure too advanced for the civilization that supposedly constructed it from scratch after 1776. The Tartaria hypothesis begins with a simple observation: the monumental architecture that fills the major cities of America, the courthouses, post offices, train stations, civic buildings, and exhibition halls of the late 19th century, does not match the labor capacity, the material supply chains, or the technical expertise of the population that official history says built it. The population of the American Midwest in the 1840s and 1850s was sparse, agrarian, and had no established tradition of constructing buildings with 40-foot ceilings, load-bearing stone facades of perfect proportion, and heating and ventilation systems whose engineering would challenge even a modern contractor. And yet the buildings are there. They have always been there. And according to the record itself, many of them already seemed old when the official record first began documenting them. The standard response is to say that immigrant craftsmen built them, that European-trained stonemasons crossed the Atlantic and raised an entirely new civilization in the American interior within a generation. But the math does not support that story. The volume of stone moved, the precision of the work, the consistency of style across thousands of miles of American geography, the sheer number of structures that would have required simultaneous construction to make the official dates believable, none of it fits the labor model the textbooks describe. What does fit, at least within this framing, is the possibility that these structures were already standing when the new American population arrived. that they were inherited rather than built. That the civilization whose infrastructure America occupies was not the one written into the founding documents, but an older one, the one that Tartaria researchers have spent a generation trying to document. A civilization they believe existed on this continent and across Eurasia before the reset events that erased it and installed the current historical narrative in its place. This is the context in which you have to understand what America had before 1913, because the free energy systems, the tax-free economy, and the central bank-free financial structure of pre-1913 America were not inventions of the new American Republic. They were remnants. They were the last operating pieces of a system that had been built by a civilization that understood something about energy, about abundance, and about the relationship between a government and its people that the architects of 1913 could not allow to survive into the modern era. Start with electricity. In 1899, Nikola Tesla began construction on Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island. The stated purpose of the project, as Tesla described it to his financier J.P. Morgan, was a global wireless communication system. But the engineering of Wardenclyffe tells a different story from the one Morgan believed he was funding. The tower was not designed simply to broadcast radio signals. It was designed to resonate with the electrical charge of the Earth itself. Tesla had discovered, through years of experimentation at his Colorado Springs laboratory, that the planet functions as a conductor. Electrical charge moves through the ground and through the upper atmosphere in patterns that can be excited and drawn upon. And a properly designed resonance system, a tower built to specific frequency relationships with the planet's natural electrical field, could make that energy available to any receiver tuned to the right frequency anywhere on Earth. Free, unlimited, extracted from the planet's own electromagnetic field. No fuel, no combustion, no vast infrastructure of cables and transformers, no meter on the side of your house, no monthly bill, no corporation standing between the source of energy and the people who needed it. Morgan terminated the funding when he understood what was actually being built. The question he reportedly asked Tesla, the question repeated in various forms across more than a century of documentation, was simple. Where do you put the meter? There was no place for a meter because the system did not allow for one. Energy delivered through the Earth's own electrical field to receivers tuned to receive it could not be monitored per household, could not be measured the way a utility measures consumption, could not be converted into a subscription. It was, by its nature, a commons, and the financial architecture of the emerging 20th century had no place for a commons it could not monetize. Wardenclyffe was demolished in 1917. The official reason was that the steel in the tower was needed for the war effort, but the demolition was ordered under the shadow of the same financial interests that had pulled Tesla's funding years earlier. And the patents, the laboratory notes, the experimental data from Colorado Springs, the full technical record of what Tesla had built and what he had proven, were seized by the United States government upon his death in 1943. Classified, removed from the public record, not released in full, not openly published, not made available to the scientific community that could have continued the work. The suppression of Tesla's energy research is not presented here as fantasy. It is described as a documented sequence of events involving named individuals, recorded financial decisions, and physical evidence in the form of a demolished tower and a classified archive. The question is not whether something happened. The question is why it mattered enough to suppress. And the answer, within this argument, is that a free energy system operating on Tesla's principles would have made the entire infrastructure of electrical billing unnecessary. Utility companies, meter systems, rate structures, regulatory capture by state power commissions, all of it would have become unnecessary. The financial system being constructed in 1913 required scarcity. It required metering. It required the conversion of every natural resource, including the electrical field of the planet itself, into a commodity with a price and a gatekeeper. But Tesla's research did not emerge out of nowhere. And this is where the Tartaria connection becomes, for many people, impossible to ignore. Tesla described his discoveries not as inventions, but as rediscoveries. He spoke repeatedly about finding principles that were already present in nature, already encoded in the structure of the physical world, waiting to be recognized rather than invented. And the architecture of the buildings that dominated American cities in Tesla's era shows signs, according to this interpretation, of a technology that understood exactly what Tesla was trying to recover. The domes and spires of the great civic buildings of the 19th century are not seen here as decorative. Their proportions are not treated as arbitrary. Researchers working in the tradition of Tartaria investigation have spent years documenting the relationship between the structural geometry of these buildings and the resonance principles that Tesla spent his life trying to explain to a scientific establishment that would not hear him. The cupolas, the finials, the copper ornamentation, the relationship between ceiling height and floor area, the placement of water features, and the routing of water through foundations, all of it follows a pattern that makes little sense as pure aesthetics and considerable sense as a system for drawing upon and distributing the ambient electrical field of the Earth. In that view, these buildings were receivers. The infrastructure of the pre-1913 American city was not built for the purposes the official record assigns to it. The post offices, the train stations, the exhibition halls, the grand hotels, the civic auditoriums with their enormous vaulted ceilings and their inexplicable acoustic properties, they were not just buildings, they were nodes in a system for harvesting and distributing what Tesla called free energy, and what the civilization that preceded the American Republic may have called something else, in a language that did not survive the reset. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago is presented as the most documented demonstration of what this system looked like in partial operation. The White City, as it was called, was powered by alternating current generators supplied by Tesla and Westinghouse. For the first time in American history, an entire complex of buildings was illuminated by electrical power at a scale the general public could experience directly. 100,000 incandescent lights, fountains lit from below, searchlights visible for miles. The effect on the millions of visitors who attended the exposition was described in contemporary accounts as almost religious, overwhelming, like a vision of a world existing outside normal time. But here is where the official record becomes, in this telling, most strained. The buildings of the White City were said to have been built for the exposition. The neoclassical structures that housed it, the Palace of Fine Arts, the Administration Building, the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, which at the time of its construction was described as the largest enclosed space in the history of the world, were presented in contemporary accounts as having been constructed in less than 2 years by a workforce of tens of thousands of laborers. But the engineering required to produce them does not sit comfortably with a 2-year timeline at any labor scale available in the 1890s. The foundations alone, the drainage systems, the structural calculations required to support the spans of the main exhibition buildings, all of it suggests an engineering achievement far beyond what should have been possible. And that is why the more radical explanation takes hold, that these structures were not built for the 1893 exposition at all, that they were found, inherited, existing structures from a previous civilization, cleaned, renovated, fitted with new electrical systems, and then presented to the American public as proof of what modern industrial civilization could supposedly accomplish in 2 years of effort. That fiction, if it was a fiction, served a purpose. The message was that American civilization under the new industrial model could create this grandeur. The implication was that it already had. Only one building from the White City officially survived: the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. It has stood for more than a century. Its construction is officially listed as 1893, but its structural integrity, its foundation design, its stone composition, and the strange absence of a detailed construction record have made it a quiet point of controversy for those who study architecture closely. Buildings constructed on the timeline and with the methods the official record describes do not usually survive more than a century of Chicago winters without constant, expensive structural intervention. This one, according to the argument laid out here, has required less than comparable structures built in the 1950s and 1960s with modern materials and modern engineering. And that raises the central claim again. It was not built in 1893. It was already old in 1893. If that is true, then the civilization that built it understood something about material science, structural engineering, and the relationship between building geometry and environmental forces that has not been recovered. And when you place that beside the financial record of the same period, the picture becomes even more unsettling. The United States operated from its founding in 1789 until 1913 without a permanent income tax. There were temporary income taxes during the Civil War, but those were understood as emergency measures and repealed when the emergency passed. The federal government funded itself through tariffs, excise taxes, and the sale of public land. And it did so while building, or at least administering, the infrastructure of a continental nation, the transcontinental railroad, the postal system, the military, the federal court system, the land-grant universities, all financed without reaching directly into the wages of individual working people. The standard explanation is that this was possible because government was smaller. That is partly true, but, according to this framing, it hides something more important. The government was smaller in part because it did not need to be large. The infrastructure it would otherwise have needed to build and maintain was already there. The grand buildings that housed federal functions were not built at federal expense in the 19th century because they did not need to be built. They were occupied. The post offices, the courthouses, the custom houses that appear in city after city across America, many of them presented as newly built in a consistent neoclassical style, far beyond the economic means of the communities they served, were not expensive new construction. They were repurposed existing structures, given new institutional identities. And then came the income tax in 1913, arriving at exactly the moment when the inheritance of the previous civilization was being fully transferred into private hands. At the moment when the cost of maintaining the new construction narrative was increasing, at the moment when the financial system being installed required a guaranteed revenue stream that could not be interrupted by a bad harvest or a trade depression. In this telling, the income tax was not a reform. It was the installation of a permanent extraction mechanism, a pipeline carrying labor value from every working person in America directly into the financial architecture being constructed around the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, created by the Federal Reserve Act and signed into law in December of 1913, becomes the clearest example of what that year actually accomplished. Before the Federal Reserve, the United States had a financial system in which money was, however, imperfectly tied to physical commodities. Gold and silver served as the anchor. The expansion of the money supply was constrained by the supply of metal. Yes, that system created instability. The panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 were real events with real consequences. But they were the instability of a system that could not expand infinitely. The Federal Reserve replaced that limit with a system managed by a private institution owned by member banks, accountable to no elected body, and given the authority to expand the money supply and charge interest to the government for the use of its own currency. The Panic of 1907 was the event used to justify it. The argument was that a lender of last resort was necessary, that the volatility of the pre-1913 system endangered ordinary Americans, and that a central bank would provide stability. But the argument made here is more severe. The Panic of 1907 was not spontaneous, it was managed. The contraction of credit that produced the panic was orchestrated by the same financial interests that later used that crisis as justification for the central banking structure that gave them permanent institutional control over the live American economy. The man who managed the response to the 1907 panic, serving as a de facto central bank in the absence of an official one, was J.P. Morgan. The same J.P. Morgan who had pulled Tesla's funding years earlier when he realized that free energy had no place in the economy he was helping build. The connection within this narrative is not accidental. It is structural. The system installed in 1913 required the suppression of free energy, the permanent extraction of labor income through taxation, and the privatization of currency issuance through a central bank. Each part reinforced the others. A population with access to free energy and no income tax would have had the economic independence to resist the financial order being installed. And a financial system without control of currency issuance could not have sustained the debt structure that the 20th century would come to depend on. That is why the three pillars of 1913 are presented not as separate reforms, but as one coordinated installation. And what this installation was placed over, according to the claim, was not a primitive economy stumbling toward modernity. It was the last functioning remnant of something genuinely different. A system in which the infrastructure of civilization, the buildings, the energy systems, the water systems, the transportation networks, had been built by a predecessor civilization at a scale and with a technical sophistication that the new system could not reproduce. It could only inherit it, then gradually strip it. Look at what happened to American infrastructure in the century after 1913. The grand civic buildings of the pre-1913 world have required constant and expensive maintenance. Why? Not because they were poorly made, but because the civilization that inherited them did not know how to maintain them at the level they were originally built. And the ones that were demolished were often not demolished because they were structurally unsound. They were demolished because maintaining them had become economically impractical inside a system built around efficiency, extraction, and replacement. Their replacements, the federal buildings, courthouses, and post offices built in the 20th century, are described here as inferior in nearly every measurable way except cost efficiency. The craftsmanship is gone. The proportions feel wrong. The materials are industrial and impermanent. The new buildings are designed for a civilization that does not intend to last. The water systems offer an even more dramatic example. The aqueducts, reservoirs, and water distribution networks of the major American cities, especially the ones officially dated to the mid-19th century, represent engineering achievements that many find difficult to reconcile with the labor costs, tools, and timelines assigned to them. New York's Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, is a 41-mile gravity-fed water delivery system built to tolerances that still appear extraordinary. According to the official record, the workforce that built it was composed primarily of Irish immigrant laborers working with hand tools in a landscape that lacked even a developed road system for material transport. But the precision of the result, in this interpretation, does not match the construction method. So the argument follows the same pattern. The aqueduct was not built in 1842. It was found in 1842 and put into service. The documentation of its construction was really a record of its adoption into the new system, not of its original creation. And maybe that is the larger pattern Tartaria researchers believe they have traced across the American continent. The official record describes adoption as construction. It describes occupancy as building. It places a new origin story on top of a physical reality that may have preceded the story by centuries. The energy that flowed through this inherited infrastructure before Tesla was suppressed, and before 1913 closed the door on the remnant system, is described as something fundamentally different from the commodity energy model of the 20th century. The buildings that received it were designed for it. The relationship between the pre-1913 American city and its energy supply was, in this view, unlike anything that came after. And the people who lived in those cities before the income tax converted their labor into a permanent object of extraction, and before the Federal Reserve converted their savings into instruments of debt, inhabited a different economic relationship with civilization itself. One the post-1913 world has made almost impossible to even imagine. This is what the Tartaria hypothesis means when it speaks of a reset. Not a sudden catastrophe that erased everything overnight, but a controlled demolition conducted over decades. One civilization's infrastructure remained in place, while another civilization's control systems were installed over it. The buildings remained, the aqueducts remained, the roads remained, but the energy system that animated them was suppressed. The financial system that had allowed the population to live without permanent extraction was dismantled, and the institutional framework that might have preserved the knowledge of what had existed was replaced by institutions whose mission was to define the new reality. The Smithsonian, the Federal Reserve, the Internal Revenue Service, the American Bar Association, formalized in its modern structure in 1878 and used, according to this framing, throughout the post-reset era to manage access to the legal system adjudicating the new property relationships. All of them are treated here as creatures of the reset window, all of them serving the same purpose that certain geological doctrines served for the physical record, establishing the definitions, installing the authorities, and then waiting for the last people who remembered the old world to die. The people who designed 1913 were not fools. They were not merely greedy men making impulsive choices for short-term gain. In this narrative, they were architects of a system meant to endure. And it has endured. The income tax is still in place. The Federal Reserve still issues currency. Tesla's free energy research remains partly hidden, partly scattered, partly inaccessible. The buildings of the previous civilization are still standing in fragments, slowly being demolished, stripped of copper ornamentation, misidentified, and reassigned to a story that makes them seem like products of the civilization that replaced the one that actually built them. But the record, the argument insists, still remains. The paintings still show the wrong-colored sky. The buildings still display proportions that no 19th century labor force should have been able to produce. The aqueducts still carry precision that no hand-tool survey crew should have achieved. The patents still hint at what Tesla was building, and why, within this framework, it had to be stopped. The financial record still shows a country that functioned for more than a century without a mechanism for systematically extracting labor income, and without a private institution controlling the creation of money. And for anyone who reads that record carefully enough, the conclusion becomes unavoidable inside this worldview. What America had before 1913 was not a primitive version of what came later. It was something else entirely, something older, something inherited, something the new system could not recreate and therefore had to redefine. It was a remnant of a civilization that had solved problems we are still pretending are unsolvable. A civilization that had built infrastructure we are still pretending was built by men with wheelbarrows and hand chisels. A civilization that understood energy in a way we are still pretending Nikola Tesla invented from nothing in a Colorado Springs laboratory. And that is why the year 1913 did not modernize America. It enclosed it. It converted the commons into property. It converted free energy into a commodity. It converted the labor of every working person into a taxable resource. It converted currency from a representation of physical value into an instrument of debt. And it did all of this in a single year, through legal instruments ratified by a political process, announced openly in newspapers that recorded every step and understood almost none of what was really being installed. Go to your nearest federal building, the old one, the one with the stone facade, the columns, the ceilings that make you feel as if you have walked into something that was never designed for ordinary human proportions. Stand inside it. Look carefully at the stonework. Ask yourself who cut those stones, who moved them, who placed them with that level of precision, in that timeline, with those tools. Then read the official plaque that tells you when it was built and by whom, and then ask yourself the question that changes everything. Is the story on that plaque an origin, or is it an adoption? Because the answer to that question changes the whole frame. It tells you that what was taken in 1913 was not just a tax policy, not just a banking structure, not just a set of energy patents. What was taken was the inheritance, the material legacy of a civilization that had done something we have not done, that had built something permanent, that had powered something freely, that had organized its economy around abundance rather than scarcity. That inheritance was real. It was physical. You can still stand inside parts of it today. They did not destroy all of it, because they could not. There was simply too much. But what they did destroy, methodically and effectively, was the knowledge of what it was. And what they installed in its place was an explanation that made everything standing in front of you appear to be the product of the civilization they were building, not the one they were erasing. They made the inheritance invisible by making it explainable. That is the real move. They gave it a false origin. They put a plaque on the wall. They assigned it a date, a builder, a reason, a neat place in a timeline that fit the new story. But the plaque is not the building. The date on the plaque is not the age of the stone. The builder named on the plaque is not necessarily the hand that set those foundations. Before 1913, the remnant was still breathing. The free energy system was still being researched. The tax-free economy was still functioning. The currency was still anchored to something physical. And the buildings were still being used for purposes closer to the ones they may actually have been built for. More importantly, the people who lived in that world had not yet been fully enrolled in the fiction that what surrounded them was their own civilization's original creation. What was built in 1913 was the fence. What we inherited was the enclosure, and every generation since then has been raised inside it, taught that the fence was always there, taught that the land inside it was always this small, taught that the only energy available is the energy you pay for, the only money available is the money they issue, the only income you keep is the income they permit you to keep. That, in this framing, is the true story of 1913, not a reform, a seizure, conducted legally, documented openly, and made invisible by the very institutions it created. The buildings are still standing. The patents are still suppressed, but not fully gone. The financial record of the pre-1913 world is still readable in archives that have not yet been digitized, and therefore, according to this argument, not yet been quietly edited. The physical record still remains for anyone willing to look at it without surrendering immediately to the plaque, the textbook, or the official caption. And that is why this line of argument insists we must read the physical record instead of the label. Read the stone instead of the plaque. Read the engineering instead of the commemorative inscription, because the stone is older than the story. It always has been. Look again at the buildings. Look again at the patents. Look again at the aqueducts, the foundations, the impossible proportions, the copper details, the vaults, the domes, the water routing, the acoustic chambers, the civic halls, the post offices, the train stations, the exhibition buildings, all of them, within this worldview, point in the same direction. They point to a civilization that was not primitive, not transitional, not fumbling toward modernity, but operating on principles of permanence, abundance, and technical knowledge that the 20th century inherited without understanding, and then dismantled without admitting it. That is why the claim about 1913 hits so hard, because it is not merely about finance, it is not merely about taxes, it is not merely about central banking. It is about enclosure on every level at once: economic enclosure, energetic enclosure, historical enclosure, even psychological enclosure. A narrowing of what people are allowed to imagine their ancestors possessed. what they are allowed to imagine civilization once was, and what they are allowed to imagine is still possible. And once that enclosure is in place, everything else follows. Free energy becomes impossible, not because it cannot exist, but because the civilization has already been trained to believe that energy must be metered. A tax-free economy becomes unthinkable, not because it never existed, but because people have been taught that permanent extraction is the natural condition of organized society. Currency anchored to physical value becomes archaic by definition, because the financial system that replaced it has already declared itself modern, inevitable, and necessary. But the official explanation only works as long as no one looks too closely at the physical remnants that survived the transition. That is the fragile point in the structure. Because the buildings still show proportions, no 19th century labor force should have been able to produce at that scale. The aqueducts still show tolerances no mid-19th century survey crews should have been able to achieve with hand tools alone. Tesla's work still points towards something that was treated not merely as innovation, but as a threat. And the financial record still shows a country that functioned for more than a century without the permanent extraction systems that were installed in 1913. So in this framing, the seizure was never just material. It was explanatory. They did not only take the system, they replaced the meaning of the system. They made people believe that scarcity was normal. They made people believe dependence was maturity. They made people believe that every building of grandeur, every trace of impossible engineering, every sign of abundance had been created by the very system that was actually replacing abundance with control. That is the enclosure. That is the fence. And that is why 1913 remains, in this narrative, the wall in American history. On one side of that wall was a country still living among the remnants of something older, larger, and more generous than the official story allows. On the other side was a country progressively cut off from that inheritance, taxed away from it, financed away from it, re-educated away from it, and finally taught not even to recognize it when standing inside it. So the next time you walk past an old federal building, do not just glance at the plaque. Look at the stone. Look at the scale. Look at the confidence of the craftsmanship, the weight of the materials, the strange sense that the structure was meant to endure in a way almost nothing built now is meant to endure. And then ask yourself whether you are looking at a product of the world that explained it, or a survivor of the world that explanation was meant to bury. Because if the stone is older than the story, then the story is not history, it is management. And if 1913 was the year that management closed over the inheritance, then what was lost was not simply a policy, a law, or a technology. What was lost was the memory of abundance itself. If this way of seeing the story stays with you, leave your thoughts below, stay with the channel, and follow for the next piece as we go deeper into the buildings, the patents, and the financial mechanisms that this argument says the plaques can never fully explain.